On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the United States was not yet fully at war. Across the Atlantic, Europe was already burning. Across Asia, Japan was pushing deeper into conflict. But for many Americans, war still felt far away. It was something happening somewhere else, something terrible, but still distant. Then, in just over 90 minutes, that distance vanished. A surprise attack on Pearl Harbor shattered the illusion of safety, crippled the American Pacific Fleet, and pushed the United States into World War II. This was not just an attack on ships in a harbor. It was an attack on time, confidence, and strategy. And before the smoke had even cleared over Hawaii, the course of the war had changed forever. By late 1941, relations between the United States and Japan had been worsening for years. Japan wanted freedom to expand across Asia and the Pacific. The United States was trying to slow that expansion through economic pressure, sanctions, and support for China. To Japanese military planners, the danger was clear. If war with the United States became unavoidable, then time would be Japan's greatest problem. America had enormous industrial strength. If given enough time, it could build ships, planes, fuel, weapons, and trained men on a scale Japan could never match. So Japanese leaders began asking a ruthless question. If war was coming anyway, how could they strike first, strike hard, and buy enough time to seize territory across the Pacific before the United States could recover? Their answer was Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was based there, on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. If that fleet could be crippled in one sudden blow, Japan hoped America would be shocked, weakened, and forced onto the defensive. In theory, that would give Japan a window to expand through Southeast Asia and the Pacific before the United States could mount a serious response. It was a bold plan. But bold plans often depend on perfect surprise. And on the morning of December 7th, surprise was exactly what Japan achieved. It was a Sunday morning on Oahu. The harbor was calm. Battleships sat in neat rows along Battleship Row. The water was still. The air felt ordinary. Many sailors were eating breakfast. Some were preparing for church. Others were just beginning what should have been a quiet day. Nothing about the scene suggested that history was about to break open. Pearl Harbor looked organized. It looked strong. It looked secure. But appearances can be deceptive. A harbor full of ships can look powerful from a distance. Yet if those ships are stationary, lined up, and unprepared for immediate combat, they can also become an ideal target. That morning, Pearl Harbor was both a symbol of American naval power and a concentration of vulnerability. The men there did not know it yet, but within minutes, their ordinary Sunday would become one of the most infamous mornings in American history. At 7:55 am, the attack began. Japanese aircraft from a carrier strike force appeared over Oahu in the first wave. They came fast, they came low, and they came with a clear mission: hit the airfields, hit the battleships, hit before the Americans could fully react. Bombs began falling. Machine guns opened up. Torpedoes raced across the water toward the ships below. The attack was carefully designed. Aircraft on the ground were to be destroyed before they could take off. Battleships in the harbor were to be disabled before they could fight back. Confusion itself was turned into a weapon. In just a matter of minutes, the quiet Sunday morning was gone. Pearl Harbor had become a battlefield, and the men inside it were being forced to adapt to war almost instantly. The Japanese were not only attacking the harbor, they were attacking America's ability to fight back. At nearly the same moment bombs began falling on the ships, fighters and bombers struck airfields across Oahu. Planes parked wingtip to wingtip were easy targets. Many never had a chance to get airborne. Within 2 hours, most American air power in Hawaii had been destroyed or badly damaged. In the harbor, the damage mounted fast. Torpedo bombers skimmed low over the water and attacked the battleships moored side by side. Dive bombers came down from above. Water columns rose beside steel hulls, decks filled with smoke, flame, and flying metal. What made the attack so effective was not only its violence, it was the way Pearl Harbor had been arranged. The very concentration that made the fleet look impressive also made it dangerously vulnerable. Ships were grouped closely together. Men were caught between fire, blast, flooding, and panic. And every minute of delay gave the attackers more room to destroy what they had come for. The Pacific Fleet was not being challenged, it was being ambushed. Then came the moment that would define Pearl Harbor forever. At about 8:10 a.m., the battleship USS Arizona was struck by a bomb. That hit triggered a catastrophic explosion. The blast tore through the ship. Flame and black smoke surged high above the harbor. Men were killed instantly. Others were trapped inside a ship that had become a furnace. Of the 2,404 Americans killed in the attack, 1,177 died on the Arizona alone. More than half of the American military dead at Pearl Harbor were lost on that single ship. That is why the Arizona is remembered not only as a battleship, it is remembered as the emotional center of the tragedy. In one violent moment, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Pearl Harbor was no longer a raid, no longer a distant crisis, no longer something that could be explained away as temporary confusion. It had become a national wound. At first, the American response was confused. Some men thought it might be a drill. Some had no clear orders. Some were simply trying to understand what they were seeing. Then the message spread through the fleet. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. And suddenly, ordinary routines turned into acts of survival. Sailors raced to anti-aircraft guns. Damage control teams fought flooding and fire. Men carried the wounded across steel decks covered in smoke, oil, and debris. What made Pearl Harbor so devastating was not only the power of the attack, it was the speed of the transition. There was almost no time to move from peace to war. One moment, men were living through an ordinary Sunday. The next, they were fighting to save ships, save friends, and save themselves. The Japanese had achieved what every surprise attacker hopes for, a few precious minutes in which shock does half the work. But those minutes did not last forever. American resistance began to harden, and as it did, the attack entered a second phase. At 8:50 a.m., the second wave arrived. By then, Pearl Harbor was already burning. Ships were listing in the water. Airfields had been shattered. Smoke covered the sky. The harbor that had looked calm less than an hour earlier now seemed broken open. American resistance was stronger now. More guns were firing. More crews were alert. The shock had given way to desperate action. But the Japanese still found targets everywhere. The second wave deepened the destruction. It turned damage into catastrophe. And it confirmed that this was not a raid meant merely to frighten the United States. It was a raid designed to cripple a fleet, break its fighting capacity, and send a strategic message across the Pacific. For the men trapped in the attack, that larger meaning hardly mattered. What mattered was surviving the next few seconds. The sky was full of noise, the harbor was full of fire, and the morning still had not ended. Shortly after 9 a.m., the attack was over. In just over an hour, more than 180 American aircraft had been destroyed. Numerous ships had been sunk or heavily damaged. The harbor was covered in smoke, wreckage, oil, and silence after violence. A total of 2,404 Americans, military personnel, and civilians were killed. Nearly 1,200 more were wounded. That scale of destruction is difficult to understand until you remember how quickly it happened. Pearl Harbor had been shocked, burned, and broken in less time than many people spend drinking coffee, reading a newspaper, or starting an ordinary morning. That compression is part of what gives the event its lasting power. The violence was concentrated, the losses were immediate, and the psychological effect was enormous. The United States was no longer watching the war from a distance. Now the war had reached American soil, and it had done so with speed, precision, and devastating effect. And yet, for all its destruction, Pearl Harbor was not the complete victory Japan hoped for. Yes, the attack was a stunning tactical success. It achieved surprise. It caused massive damage. It shocked the American public to the core. But it failed in ways that would matter even more. America's aircraft carriers were not in the harbor that morning, and those carriers would soon become central to the war in the Pacific. Japan also failed to destroy key infrastructure that could have made long-term recovery far more difficult. Oil storage, repair capacity, and other vital facilities survived. Many of the damaged ships were later repaired and returned to service. So Pearl Harbor became one of history's great military paradoxes. A brilliantly executed surprise attack did not knock the United States out of the war. Instead, it did something else. It awakened a far larger enemy. The Japanese had won a dramatic morning, but in strategic terms, they had helped unleash an industrial and military response they could not ultimately defeat. That is why Pearl Harbor matters not only as a tragedy, it matters as a warning. A tactical victory can still contain the seeds of strategic failure. The next day, December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress and the nation. He called December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Those words mattered because they gave the shock a clear national meaning. This was not to be remembered as a confusing disaster. It was to be remembered as an act of deliberate aggression. Congress moved quickly. War against Japan was approved. Days later, Germany declared war on the United States. Now the conflict was no longer a distant global crisis observed from across the ocean. America was in it, fully, irreversibly, and on a scale that would help determine the outcome of the entire war. Pearl Harbor did not merely begin America's Pacific War. It helped transform World War II itself, turning the United States from an anxious observer into one of the central powers that would shape the conflict's final outcome. So how did 90 minutes change the entire Second World War? They destroyed ships. They killed thousands. They shocked a nation. But more than that, they ended the last illusion that the United States could remain untouched by the conflict. Pearl Harbor was supposed to buy Japan time. Instead, it gave the United States clarity, fury, and purpose. From the smoke rising over that harbor came a new phase of the war, one that would stretch across oceans, continents, factories, battlefields, and years of relentless fighting. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to weaken America. Instead, it unified it. It was meant to delay American power. Instead, it accelerated American resolve. And that is why Pearl Harbor still matters, because in just over 90 minutes, the balance of history shifted. The Pacific War changed. The American role in World War II changed, and the modern world that would emerge from that war changed with it. That morning began in calm water and ordinary routines. It ended as one of the most consequential mornings of the 20th century.